All right, chapter 14, section 1 is all about weathering. You got to remember we're talking about rocks and minerals here. So that word weather to you isn't like what it was when we were in the actual chapter about weather. So we've talked about the three main types of rocks, sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous. And now we're going to be talking about what can happen on Earth essentially after they form. One of those processes that can happen is something called weathering. So you may have noticed before, just even looking at mountains, that you may notice that some mountains have sharp peaks, some mountains are kind of rounded, like you see on the picture here for the Smoky Mountains. And that's because weathering occurs in nature, and it's for lots of different reasons. It can be due to sun's energy, it can be because of the wind, because of water, but all of those things can help break down rock over time as it sits out in the environment. And that process of breaking that rock down into other things is called weathering. So when you look at the Smoky Mountains and compare those to the Canadian Rocky Mountains, look at the difference between the two. So clearly you can see that the Canadian Rocky Mountains have more sharp, jagged peaks, whereas the Smoky Mountains are more rounded, and that's all because of weathering. So the ones on the left, the Smoky Mountains, are older than the Rocky Mountains because you can clearly see that weathering over time has had its chance to kind of wear its toll on the Smoky Mountains and then make it more rounded. So at one time, the Smokies were actually as tall as the Rockies, and they had sharp peaks, but it's just over time. And once again, remember when we're talking about geology, this is a long process. This isn't hundreds of years. This is millions of years because of all that sun's energy from weathering, wind, and water. Those sharp peaks that once used to be the Smoky Mountains are now rounded, and you can see it actually is going to cut height off those mountains as well. So younger mountains, we're going to see have more sharp, jagged peaks, and then the older mountains are going to be more rounded. So you have two main types of weathering, and here's the first type of weathering. It's called mechanical weathering. When you think about mechanical, think about stuff that has parts to it, or things that is actually going to break something into smaller parts. So in mechanical weathering, you're going to have forces break or chip rocks into smaller pieces, and it doesn't change the composition of what it is. So it's just breaking it up into those smaller parts. So mechanical weathering, breaking rocks up into smaller parts, but you're not actually changing what it is. So if you had a piece of granite, let's say that's what's on the slide here, it does kind of look like that's what it is. Mechanical weathering would break that up into smaller parts, but it's still going to be granite. It didn't turn into another type of rock like in the rock cycle. Nothing else happened. It's still granite. It's just smaller pieces of granite. So that's what mechanical weathering is, breaking rocks into smaller parts without changing their composition. Changing conditions of wetness and dryness can cause those rocks and minerals to break down. So one of the major ways we can have mechanical weathering occur is running water. So you think about rivers, think about streams. That running water over time can not only wear away on rocks and cause those rocks to break into smaller parts, those rocks are going to kind of bounce around against each other, also once again breaking them up into smaller parts. Anytime you come across in nature, as you can see in the slide here, these beautifully rounded rocks, that's your clue to you that, hey, this was around running water for a really long period of time. Frost wedging can actually split rocks apart slowly as water freezes. Water is a very powerful thing, and I think we know that living in northern Minnesota. Anytime we have cracks, if water can get in there and then it's going to freeze, it's going to expand, and that's what ice does. If you've ever accidentally left something in the freezer before, you know that. That was a liquid. Let's say you had a pop or something and you wanted to get it cold quick. You put it in the freezer, you forgot about it, next day come around, oh my gosh, it's a giant mess in your freezer. Water expands when it freezes, and it's a really powerful agent for mechanical weathering because it is so powerful. So we see this in our sidewalks, we see this in our roads. That's why if you have a sidewalk, or let's say you have some concrete on your driveway, if you have a crack, it's so important to fill it in before the winter time, because if water gets in there and does its action, it's only going to make that crack bigger. Plants can actually mechanically break down rocks. Think about trees and their roots and how powerful they are. So plants can cause weathering when their roots grow into small cracks in rocks. And shockingly, animals can actually also cause weathering when they dig into soil or burrow underground. So all of these things, running water, frost wedge, plants, animals, all of these things can play into mechanical weathering. Your book also talks about this process called exfoliation. So it's a weathering process that results in rock layers peeling away as they expand or contract, and Half Dome in Yosemite is a beautiful example of that. Slowly over time, it's just, we use that term a lot when you talk about cleaning your face. When you use exfoliation for your face, you're just peeling away layers of your dead skin. Same thing happens in nature naturally. It's just peeling away rock layers. So if you hear that word exfoliation for geology, that's what it is. Wind, another thing, you see this really a lot if you guys go out to the Southwest. So wind is a weathering agent. Wind-blown sand can actually be really powerful. I'm sure you've heard of the term sandblasting before. That's one of the ways that we can remove paint from things. It's just nature's way of essentially doing sandblasting. So wind is a really important weathering agent as well. So here's a beautiful picture, obviously in Sedona, Arizona. They're called hoodoos, or those really tall pillars, and those were formed by wind. Once again, really long period of time for that to happen. Now, the other type of weathering we can have, so all of those were mechanical, did not change the composition of the rock. Our other type of weathering is chemical weathering. So chemical weathering, rock is reduced to smaller pieces by chemical reaction. So you are actually going to be changing the composition of the rock when we are talking about chemical weathering. On the statue here, you can kind of see on the face there, some of that rock is wearing away, and that's actually what is happening on the surface of that statue is chemical weathering. So you're changing the composition of the rock. So how does this happen? So one of the ways is acid rain. So when we put certain pollutants into the air via, think about when we are burning our fossil fuels, we can actually create a very acidic environment for rain, producing essentially sulfuric acid that rains down to the earth. So one of the things that can do is actually cause damage to rocks that are outside. Another thing, I guess, that it could do also environmentally, but it doesn't have to do here, is affect lakes. It can affect fish populations. So some fish populations are really sensitive to acid. So if you are living in an area where acid rain occurs, you may not have a high fish population in that lake because of all of the acid rain here. Here's a great example also of how something that someone does in one place can affect something nationally or globally. It doesn't necessarily mean this is going to be happening like right next to a factory, right next to a production plant or something. That water, that rain is going to get carried far away. Moss and lichen can actually also cause chemical weathering on rock. If you've ever looked at moss and lichens on rock before and you look at the roots, you kind of peel it up a little bit off the rock, you can see it. And it really works quite quickly actually as well. So moss and lichen can actually also change the chemical composition of the rock and then break it down. So both physical and chemical weathering can affect the rock at the same time. All of these things can be happening depending upon the environment it's in. You can have wind, you can have water, you can have plants, you can have chemical things going on. So all of these things can be happening. Doesn't just necessarily mean that one thing is going to be happening at one time. If you guys ever hear the term biological weathering, that's referring to something that is because of something alive. So when we talk about mechanical and chemical weathering, and if it's biological, means something alive had something to do with that. So the squirrel is alive, the plant is alive, the moss and lichens are alive. That's what biological weathering is. Remember, bio means life. So biological weathering is because of things that are alive. So overall, when we talk about chemical weathering, mechanical weathering, what are factors that are going to affect that? So first of all, weathering is going to be slowest in dry, cold climates. So you could take that statement and go the opposite direction. It's going to be fastest in wet, warm climates. So slowest in dry, cold climates, fastest in warm, wet climates. So think of like tropical rainforests, you're going to be having really high amounts of weathering for any exposed rock. Obviously, like we talked about running water speeds up mechanical weathering. Water is very, very powerful. That power of water can really do a lot of weathering to rocks quickly. Kind of minerals found in a rock also affect how fast it weathers. So if you compare two types of rock, take something like, let's say, sandstone, and then a rock like granite, whereas sand is made up of those smaller particles, granite is made up of those other minerals. The sandstone is probably a little bit more susceptible to the running water than the granite is. The sandstone would break down much quicker than the granite would. So the kind of minerals found in a rock will also affect how fast it weathers. So not all rocks weather at the same rate. Finally, the greater the surface area that's exposed, the faster it's going to weather. So the more surface area you have exposed, the faster it's going to weather. If you have a rock, only a small part of it sticking out, then obviously it's going to take much longer to break down versus, let's say, you have the whole entire rock exposed. Or if you have rock that's broken up into smaller parts, greater surface area, faster it's going to weather. So those are our two main types of weathering: mechanical weathering and chemical weathering. Mechanical weathering is just breaking up rocks into smaller parts because of wind, water, frost wedging, biological things like plants or animals. And then chemical weathering, we're changing rock and actually changing its composition from things like acid rain or moss and lichen, which can also do that. So those are two types of weathering: mechanical, not changing what it is; chemical, changing what it actually is.